introduction. Hey guys, welcome back to Keep It 99, the most edifying podcast in the world. And I'm joined here today with Andreh Labib. Thank you, Andreh, for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Isaiah. I'm
So-
glad you're in Jersey.
Thank you. So the first question, or the first thing we're going to talk about is just about who you are, what you do. So just tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yeah. So my name is Andreh Labib. I live in Jersey. I go to St. Mary's, East Brunswick. I was born in Egypt, but then family moved here when we were like 4 or 5 years old. Right now, I'm a biomedical engineer, but hopefully going to medical school soon. And I grew up in this church my whole life, serve in this church. Hopefully, if I ever leave, I always find my way back here.
So thank you for coming onto the podcast. It's a great blessing to have you.
It's a blessing to be here with you, bro.
So what we're talking about today is about a topic that is pretty easy to see around us. We're talking about the saints today, and we're talking about reading. So my first question for you has to do with your personal journey within the Coptic Church. How have saints and reading influenced your journey within the church and your faith?
So reading was a thing I was always into since I was young, in school, but it was never like church reading. It's, Harry Potter, big fan of Percy Jackson. And it was mostly the fictional reading. And then as I grew, started to get into other readings. In terms of reading specifically into church, as far as I could remember, probably started either middle school or high school. So we have a thing here called the Philly competition, where you read a spiritual book and everyone goes to compete about it. I did it for a few years. The first one that I vividly remember, we were reading actually on the life of St. Anthony by Pope Shenouda. And so that was the first one that vividly comes to mind. And then over time, I just kept getting more into reading, more into saints. At home, my mom would always just have saint movies going. That's all we watched. And then also, as I grew through high school, thank God we have a lot of wonderful, great servants who lead us here. So my servant, Mike, actually, he was the one that got me more in depth into reading, and specifically more in that way about church fathers. And so that's when that started. But before that, it was just reading about saints and then just reading for fun.
So how do you think that getting into the saints, getting into reading has affected your faith as you've grown older?
One thing about history is there's nothing new under the sun, right? So everything up until this point, any situation you've ever been in has been experienced by someone else, and they've come out on the other side. And I think that's what we learn the most from the saints. I think, especially the saints, it's a very personal connection you have with them. And I think the greatest example of that from now has been Pope Kyrillos. We learn a lot from his life on how to have connection with the saints. And relating that back to myself, obviously we all want to have a connection with the saints like Pope Kyrillos did. But I think that all starts from knowing that they're actually there. So when you have the presence of mind of, these saints are with us throughout life, like we say in Hebrews, we have so great a cloud of witnesses, then you start to realize that, hey, they are with me. So when I come back to relate that to my life, knowing that there's nothing new under the sun, I'm struggling with this sin, let me go to St. Moses. I know he struggles with a bunch of sins, so he can help me out. I'm in school, I'm struggling, I'm doing bad in class, right? Let me go to the saints that we know to be geniuses, right? Let me go to St. Athanasius, let me go to St. Cyril. Growing up, I know I've heard in a bunch of sermons that for every class you take, give that class an intercessor, right? So it relates all of your daily lives to the saints. I think this is something that's strongly present in Egypt that we've kind of lost here, but I think with the newer generation, it's starting to grow again, especially with all the great books that are coming out now about the saints.
You mentioned a lot about having the saints almost as your friends, kind of like how Pope Kyrillos was Saint Mina. We always see him depicted in icons together. However, a lot of people doubt the validity of the saints and doubt the power that the saints can hold. What do you say to those people, and what are some pieces of advice that you would give to some people who don't really buy into it?
I think friendship with the saints is something that could be seen throughout all of church history. like even if we look at the 4th century, like the greatest saints that we come to think about now, like they were friends when they were alive. Like Saint Athanasius, he writes in the beginning of Life of Anthony, like I used to wash his hands, which means like Saint Athanasius was discipled to Saint Anthony, and those are the two of the greatest saints in the church, right? And I think some of that doubt sometimes comes from lack of belief in intercession. And like, why can't I just pray directly to God? Like, what's the point of intercession? Obviously, intercession is something we see throughout the whole Bible, and we see it like, throughout the life of Christ, right? Wedding of Cana of Galilee. What happened? People who ran out of wine, who did they tell? They told St. Mary. And then St. Mary went and told our Lord Jesus Christ. Could they have went to him directly? Yeah. But when they go through St. Mary, she has a special or different relationship with Christ than they do. And it's almost the same way in the saints of not saying they're closer to the Christ in the sense that they have a close relationship with him. And if I want to pursue that relationship, I look to their life for help. So we'll ask them for intercessions. It's the same way, like if you're going up to the dean of the school and you're really close to a professor and you want to ask the dean for something, you're going to go to the professor and be like, hey, can you ask him for me? The same way it happens in secular life, it happens in Christian life. And I think the more we treat saints as if they're there, the more they will respond as if they're there. So for example, when you go somewhere and all your friends are there, what's the first thing you do? You go dap up all your friends. You go say hi, and then you go sit with them and talk. Same way, I think when we come to church, we were always taught first thing you go do is you pray. After praying, what do? Go to the icon of the saint. We believe very highly that in the icon of the saint, there's almost a connection to that saint there because of its chrismation or consecration with the Maroon. So you go, you kiss the icon of the saint, you go, you tell them hello as if you would like your friends at church.
You mentioned earlier about St. Athanasius and St. Anthony. And for me, when you look at those two specifically, there's almost a dichotomy between them. How St. Athanasius was this great mind and St. Anthony was this simple monk. And I feel like it's the same way with us in our interactions with the saints. It's kind of the same thing. Whether we're the simple or the mind, whichever one of the two roles that we take with the saints, I think that in the same way how they learn from each other, we should learn from those saints. And the best way to do that, in my personal opinion, is through reading. So what would you say is the connection between reading and the saints, and why did you choose those two topics, honestly, to go together?
All right, so this question specifically, the reason I always bring up St. Anthony and St. Athanasius is they are like my two favorite saints. I think that dichotomy is a little misunderstood, actually. St. Anthony, while he had no formal education, I think he was one of the brightest minds, obviously, in the church, or in the sense of there are traditions that go that when St. Athanasius was writing on the Incarnation, St. Anthony was the one who would edit it. So he would go to St. Anthony and be like, hey, what do you think? And obviously there's a bunch of stories of St. Anthony where like philosophers of his time go to him and they try to question him, and St. Anthony, who had no education, still like overcomes them. The reason those two are my favorite is I also love the connection between them of, you see like discipleship in real life, right? St. Athanasius is my main intercessor because he is the great theological mind, but he's also a disciple to the greatest ascetic of all time. So it's like he had like the best of both worlds in my view. But through all that, you get to the point of St. Athanasius wrote the Life of Anthony. Again, when we're talking about reading of the saints, I think it's really important that the reading of the saints is edifying to ourselves. We see this with other saints. St. Augustine, a big point of his conversion was reading Life of Anthony, right? So we could see that we could learn so much from the lives of the saints through reading, because reading of in itself like purifies the mind, right? Whatever you get in, whatever you put in, you get out. And so when you're putting into your mind, like St. Paul says, whatever things are edifying, whatever things are good, like these contemplate on. And then I also think it depends from person to person. There was a monk, we were talking to him one time, and he was telling us like you have to kind of learn like your spiritual love language. Like, you know how they say there's 5 love languages?
Yeah.
Same way with their spiritual life. Some people are very, very touched by reading. Some people are very, very touched by hymns. Some people are very, very touched by service. We need all of them, obviously. But whatever way you feel connects to you the most, or like brings you to the remembrance of God the most, that way is like the way you would pursue it. So it just happens. For me, it's the saints in reading.
I really like that point you made about how like the spiritual love language. I really like that, because I think a lot of times we forget that the earthly is a mirror of the heavenly. Like there are things that are connected, of course. I mean, as beings, we have a spirit and a body. So that spirit has spiritual needs, the same way how our body has bodily needs, and that there's a connection between the two. And I really like the point you make about that spiritual love language, because I think a lot of times we kind of brush it under the rug and we just assume that we need to serve, we need to learn all the hymns, and we need to do all the reading. When, like you said, in reality, there's for each person, it's very different. And I think even if you look at the saints, you see the same thing. Yeah. I mean, we have a lot of saints behind us. Let's think of some examples. But, you know, some saints were, you know, very, like for example, we'll use the 2 saints we just used, but Saint Athanasius is a great writer. I mean, that's what he's most known for, is writing and the creed and all that. Whereas
Saint Anthony, some claimed was illiterate.
Exactly.
So it's two complete opposites.
Or you have, for example, like Ibrahim Ayed, not a saint yet, but, you know, someone who's on the path to be that, who's, you know, like revolutionized hymnology. Yeah. Or Habib Girgis, who revolutionized education. Yeah. It's like, it reminds me of when St. Paul says, like, there are preachers, there are teachers, there are evangelists, there are people who speak in tongues, there are prophets, there's a role for every single person. Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of looking at the saints as not, you know, all these individuals, but as one collective group, that they complete the body of Christ, they complete that unity in the same way how we should as a church, like on earth.
There was a beautiful quote someone told me once where it said, I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact quote, but it was almost as if every saint is like God, but every saint is unique. So it's like comparing like all these different types of flowers are flowers, but they're all unique in what they are. Like the only reason this works is God is eternal. He's infinite, right? In his infinity, there are so many different aspects that we could take all of those different aspects. So no 2 saints are alike. This was the exact quote. No 2 saints are alike, but they are all like God. And I think that's really powerful, especially when, so I serve high schoolers, and a big problem you see in high school is like trying to like find like identity, right? So in terms of like finding identity, you see all the saints were distinctly themselves. They were trying to be no one else. They were trying to be themselves. In the same way that Saint Moses, he's a jokester. What we know from him is he's a jokester. He liked to have fun. Like there's a story of a monk who's going, either a monk or a visitor was going and he was trying to meet Saint Arsenius and Saint Moses. He waits outside of Saint Arsenius' door. Saint Arsenius doesn't let him in, doesn't talk to him, doesn't pay him any mind. And then Saint Moses, the versions that I've heard, it's like he goes to him on a Friday, and Saint Moses breaks his fast. He like kills the calf. He sits with him. He has fun, and like he chills with him. So this monk's like mad confused. He's like, "What do I do? Like Saint Arsenius wouldn't talk to me, and we know Saint Arsenius is holy, and we also hear of this great Saint Moses who just broke his fast on a Friday and like chilled with me." And then he saw like in a vision 2 boats, and they were 2 separate boats, but they were going on the same way. And what he learned from it is like they're both going to heaven, but they're different paths. And so the path isn't for me to imitate someone else. It's for me to live my Christianity in my full identity, but again, to do good and to resemble Christ.
Yeah, and I think that reminds me of when St. Paul says to imitate Christ, like imitate me like I imitate Christ. Yeah. And it's not imitate him like do what he does, but it's imitate the fact that he's imitating Christ.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I never thought about it like that.
I think that's exactly what all the saints do. Like you could look at the varieties of saints where you have the soldier saints. And the soldier saints back in that day, like what differentiated is just not like the weapons you used, but like how physically strong you were. So like St. George was jacked, right? Like St. Mina, like they were all like big bodies and jacked, right? Versus you go all the way to the other end of St. Anthony, who's an ascetic. And it's not to say that either one's right or wrong.
Or like Avon Ofer, that's sort of above your head.
Yeah, or St. Ofer. Like you look at everything and you realize they just all fulfilled their Christian duty and became who they were in Christ. As long as it's in Christ, the most important part is to be who you are.
I like that. So I kind of want to move the conversation a little bit into examples of saints.
Yeah.
When it comes to Coptic tradition, because there's a lot of saints that are close to the Coptic people's hearts for specific things. What are some examples of that, or some things maybe in your own personal life about saints that you're close with, or that the Coptic people in general are close with? Why is that? Why those saints?
So I think over time, throughout the Coptic Church, we become like obsessed like with different saints. It's obvious in the time. I think it was lost for a long period of time, but then in the time of Pope Kyrillos, the saint who is being a big revival was Saint Mina, and now the big saint of the Coptic Church is Pope Kyrillos. Like anything you ask, you go straight to Pope Kyrillos. Like he's always the first intercessor for everything, and that's partly because he works very quickly, but he becomes the intercessor for a lot of things. And I think that's the importance of having a lot of different intercessors and not just one or two. One or two is great, obviously, but the same way you have different friends for different things, you have intercessors for different things. We say obviously the martyrs, they hold a higher ranking, so when we ask for their intercessions, it's usually for things that we need like done ASAP. If we're struggling with a certain type of sin, we'd go to a saint who struggled with that sin. So Saint Moses is the clear one because he struggles with a lot of lustful sins. So like us as youth, when we struggle with lust, we go directly to Saint Moses. We're like, hey, like you struggle with this, help us out. Again, when we were studying for classes, you go to the smarter saints, or like the ones we know to be smart, like Saint Cyril, Saint Athanasius. So different saints have their different things. The clear ones, Anbawanis. I don't know if it's for you guys, but for us, Anbawanis was always the one when we like things get lost. Yeah. Right? Go straight to Anbawanis. Somehow you always find it. So I think those are like the general ones for the churches, and then for personal ones, I think that grows through knowing the personality of the saint a little more. Some saints, their personality is very clear and obvious, and some saints, like, it's not as clear, but the more you learn about them, the more you get to know them, the more their personality becomes clear, and you develop a relationship with them. And once you develop that relationship, for example, I give a lot of the saints that I have as intercessors, they have like specific like rules, or like specific things I only ask them for. And I think that just develops. The more you get to know someone, the more you know what they're really good at. And that's why you ask them for that certain thing.
So how do you, it's very apparent that you spend a lot of time with the saints. How do you kind of build that relationship with them, that friendship with them that so many people yearn for?
So like I was saying, a big part of it is not pretending, but knowing that they're actually there. So, for example, a small thing you could do during the liturgy is when there's a saint that you hear during the commemoration, like you just say their name if they're your intercessor. So like if I hear like Saint Athanasius, I'll say, "Hail Saint Athanasius," do the sign of the cross and a little bow. Like that's knowing that he's there in the present moment, right? Or when you come to church, again, go say hi to the saints that you have that closer relationship to. Abuna Daniel Fanous, in his book Silent Patriarch, he actually talks about how sometimes we choose the saint, sometimes the intercessor also chooses us, or like they'll see something in us that resembles them, and for some reason they'll develop a close relationship with us. So for Saint Mina and Pope Kyrillos, like, what do they have in common? Well, Saint Mina was a clear ascetic. After he was in the army, he went and lived in Egypt in the desert by himself. And we see the same model of Pope Kyrillos, where he goes, and even though he's in the monastery, he then goes and lives by himself in solitude. So I think the more your life resembles the life of a saint, you develop a relationship with him. And then the more, obviously, you read about them. One very big thing here for us is our beloved priest, Abuna Moros, loves to celebrate the saints. So whenever there's a saint, we always do an Ashaya for it. And so like a small thing like that, like if you know it's your friend's birthday, you're going to tell them happy birthday. Same way with the saint, like if it's their feast, go to church for their feast. Attend the Vespers, attend the liturgy. Maybe for Saint Philippetir, for example, there are stories where it says, whoever offers to the poor on my day, like I will intercede for them. So on the feast of Saint Philippetir, we do like a homeless run to like fulfill that promise, right? So there are these certain things with every saint, and again, the more you get to know them, the more your relationship grows with them. But it can be awkward at first, right? Like, everyone's going to think you're weird if every time you go to church, you go to these two icons, you kiss them, if they see you bowing down, like random parts of the liturgy. But I think that's part of creating a relationship, you know? It's going to be awkward at first, but it grows.
I really love how the way you talk about the saints, almost like they're companions, you know, they're friends, they're real people that like you share in life with, just kind of like your friends in general. And I think that really shows the Coptic Church, because the Coptic Church is the Church of the Martyrs. The Coptic Church is full of so many saints. I mean, this room is, people can only see one corner of this room. We're surrounded by the entire room, just filled with walls like this. And I feel like just sitting in the presence of the room, like you feel like the saints are there. And you made a good point about in the liturgy when the saints gets mentioned, that you bow down to the sign of the cross. I know I've heard contemplations, and they're true contemplations, that like the saints are present. You know, we are with the heavenly. I don't know if you read the book Elements.
Yeah,
I'm sure you have.
My favorite book.
I'm sure, but in that book they talk about in one of the liturgies that the main character prays, how he asked for God to open his eyes, and he saw, cherubim, to the length, to the height of the church, and all the heavenly creatures and all the heavenly hosts, and he saw in the commemoration the saints come to the altar and take the blessing of the altar. Yeah. And I think, like, I remember when I read that, it's like, this is so real. Our faith is so real. It's not just, something that we do, or so, it's not. And a lot of people think, oh, we're commemorating something in the past. No, we're living in the present of the past. That's why in the institution narrative, the priest breaks the body. He tastes the wine. Like, he does what Christ did, because we're not reliving it. We are living it.
Yeah, and that's, to go off your point, that's the word that's used in the Greek, like anamnesis. That means to bring an event into the present, right? So we're living everything. That's why we don't say Christ was risen. No, right now we're in the Holy 50, we say Christ is risen, because he is risen now. And that's why we try to live these things out because they occurred in the present. And I think, like, one of the saints says, like, thank God that God closed our eyes, that we don't see the priest actually breaking the body of Christ. Like, it was almost a blessing that we don't get to see that. Obviously, all of us want to see the saints. All of us want to see these angels. And that's amazing. But there's a reason we don't see them, and we just have to accept that. Yeah. But that doesn't negate the fact that they're present with us.
It reminds me of a homily during Holy Week. I don't know exactly when it is. I think it might be Thursday night, where St. John Chrysostom is getting a little bit heated with his congregation, and he's telling them about, like, how dare you stand here in this church and be mindless of what's happening before your eyes? How dare you stand here and not realize what is happening? How do you not, like, the God of the universe, the creator of the universe, humbled himself and takes this medium of the bread, humbles himself and becomes this bread. He becomes his body, and the wine becomes his blood. And, like, the priest gets to hold that body and hold that blood, and you get to partake of that. You get to become one with the creator of the universe. And he's like, how dare you, think all these things or be hypocrites? And he goes on and on. It gets pretty heated, actually. And the rest of the homily, there's only a short excerpt of that homily in. If you read the entire homily, it's he talks about how dare you stare into the eyes of the gates of hell and not realize that that's where you're standing. And he goes crazy in it, but it reminds me, like, how real the church is. And I think that's what the saints are for us as a Coptic church. They're a reminder that the church is living, the church is real, the church continues. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about having a church with apostolic roots, is that we have from St. Mark all the way to, the newest saints of our church, Happy Georgios Pope Kyrillos, and people who go on to become saints. And I think that's the beauty of the Coptic Church, is that, we are a church full of saints, in the past, in the present, and in the future.
Yeah. To go off that, like, point of the Eucharist, like, that's the greatest miracle of all, right? Like, this bread and wine becoming the body and blood. And, like, if we believe in that, like, why wouldn't we believe in the existence of saints?
Exactly.
Like, that's something so much smaller to believe in than the body and blood being the body and blood,
Yeah. I think it's because we take it for granted.
Yeah.
right? We come to liturgy every single Sunday or Friday or Wednesday, whenever you come, and it's just, these hymns, the communion, move on. And the last podcast I had just right before this, I had Dr. Zaire on, and we were talking about praise. And we're talking about, why do you do all these long hymns? And the reason why is just to spend more time with God.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, why do we venerate all these saints? Because they have finished the good race, they have fought the good fight, they have eternity with God. And we just want to reach the same level.
Yeah. It's just, they did it before us, and we're like, hey, help us out. Like,
exactly.
Like when you're applying for schools, you ask people who got into those schools, like, hey, how did you do it?
Yeah, of course.
Right? In the same way that saints got there before us. So we asked them for a little help.
Yeah, and it's a great way to think about it. And I think that goes along with the reading point very well, about how reading is, it's almost like our window into these people's lives. I mean, because that's what reading is. That's what words are. Words are a way to express, things for eternity.
Yeah.
So it's our way of looking into the lives of these people. And I think when it comes to reading, there's obviously reading about the saints, and there's just reading spiritual books in general. And I think that, especially because we're in the Holy 50, just finished the season of Lent, reading is a big emphasis around this time of year. Because, like you said, reading purifies the soul, it purifies the brain. It's like the way of righteousness is to read and to live in that life. So what is some advice for people in this day and age to, get into reading, why reading, like almost like sell the point of, reading?
Yeah. I think if people are trying to get into reading, like, get into something you like, right? Don't force yourself to read something that you have no interest in, because that'll only quell like the desire to read. So when you start with something you like, it becomes easier, and like then you expand out. One thing a monk told us is to be balanced in your reading, in the sense of, if you read too much theology, you're gonna hate reading because it's very technical. But if you read too much like saint stories, then you're never gonna get the theological benefit. So it's like both are needed, right? You can't separate the spiritual from the theological. And then you mentioned it before about Elements. I think Elements is a great place to start, because it doesn't feel like you're reading
of course,
a spiritual book, right?
Yeah.
It feels like you're reading a story, and then like Abuna, like when you're a kid, like your mom would like put like your medicine in something really sweet. That's what it kind of feels like, right? He's putting in these spiritual teachings, and you don't realize that he's giving you a sermon halfway through the book, but you're just like reading the book because the book in itself is interesting.
I mean, and apart from like the spiritual benefit, I mean, it's just a good book.
Exactly.
It's very well written. Whoever wrote the book, it's a secret, but whoever wrote the book, like, obviously very talented. And I think that, like you said, it's a very good starting point, and it's a very, not even just starting point, it's just a very good book. And I think it, what it does is it really proves that point. Like you said, you can't separate the spiritual from the theological
At all.
And I feel like that book really shows you that that's true. Because what, I'm obviously not going to give any of the book away, but it takes these theological matters and puts it into the life of someone and shows you the inner thoughts of that person and their interactions in their entire life.
Yeah.
And because of that, you're able to see, almost a spiritual maturing. Like, it literally walks through the main character from birth to, some form
Everyone
of death,
dies.
just to death. And then there's some more stuff that comes after, but that's beside the point. The thing is that in the same way in our spiritual lives, I feel like I said this on every single podcast on this trip, but there's a progression of our spiritual life. Yeah. And it's the same thing. I feel like you were talking about the saints a second ago, that just died. We'll ignore that. Like with the saints, like there's a progression. Like you start by, I read this story, the saint sounds cool, to, let me ask for the intercession. And then it becomes a relationship. Yeah. Just like everything else in life is a progression. So I feel like the thing with reading is that it really puts into perspective, who God is in like the aspects of who people are. Like it puts God into perspective of who we are. Yeah. That makes sense.
It gives you the thing about reading is it gives you the perspective, or like how this person dealt with God. And even though I'm different than this person, there's something I could learn from how this person dealt with God. And when you read a bunch of different things, you realize, God interacts in this many different ways. And obviously to a higher level, that is what the Bible is. It's the story of how Abraham dealt with God and David dealt with God. Abraham and David are different people, and you could see it. God deals with them in different ways, right? So it kind of gives you a glimpse of, like you said, into who God is. And obviously, reading the Bible is different than reading spiritual books, but I think spiritual books, like we said, are super important. And even Elements, I think the brilliance of Elements is that like when Abuna wrote it, right, he was using a concept that hasn't been tapped into much in the church, which is fiction. But I don't understand why it wasn't tapped into, personally. But in the sense that when Christ wanted to teach people, how did he do it?
Fiction.
He did it through fiction. Yeah. He did it through parables, right? And so in the same way, Abuna tried to do that now. He used these fiction, he used these parables to teach people. And I think it was untapped until now, and I think we'll start to see more and more.
Of course, yeah.
Now of fiction, not even books anymore, right? Movies, videos, podcasts, like these ways to tap into Christ. And I think all that's amazing because it gets us to connect to God in a deeper level.
Of course, I agree 100%. But yeah, like you said, I think, that the fiction aspect of it is definitely something that we'll see more of. I think it's an important part because, I mean, you look at all the best books in history of Harry Potter. You mentioned Harry Potter, Percy Jackson earlier. Like, they're good books. Why? Because they're not real. Like, there's nothing real about it. Sometimes real life becomes boring. In the same way with Elements, I feel like, it's just a great way to package who Christ is in our lives and how we can live that life, because it shows like I don't really want to give the book away, but it shows someone who wasn't really like that and became like that, just like a lot of us are. Like, I don't know about you, but I know me, like, early high school, like I was at church, but I wasn't really in church. You know what I'm saying? Like, I was there, but I wasn't there. And I think it's a struggle for a lot of us youth. And I think what changed it for me was reading. To be honest, reading is what changed that for me. I don't know what changed it for you. I'll ask you, but so what changed that for you? If you had that faith, I don't know if you did. Some people don't. But
reading was definitely a big part of it. I think the big part when that changes is when people start like applying what they learned to church and realize that it's like we've been constantly saying throughout this whole thing, it applies to every aspect of your life. Right, once you stop separating church and like real life, that's when like things start to change. Yeah. That's when you realize it's all connected.
I think it comes I think that comes when you take ownership.
Yeah. You
take ownership of your faith. You put your faith on you. You take ownership of it. That's when that happens. Yeah. And I think the reason why it happens to a lot of people around 16, 17 is that's when you get a lot of freedom. It's when you get a car. Yeah. That's when that's when you have to start taking ownership of life.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, for people who've grown up in the church, that's when you make that decision. Do you stay? Do you kind of waver off? And I think that's why it's so important for people our age, a little bit younger, to, put that foot in, especially with reading in the Saints.
Yeah. I think all it takes, especially in the beginning, is a little commitment, and you see God gives a bunch of grace. Like in the beginning, it grows very fast, and some people then later become discouraged that it's growing really fast, and when it doesn't grow as fast anymore. But I think that's just part of it. Like, the one thing that always comes up when we feel like that loss of grace, it's you forcing yourself to ask the question, do you like God, or do you like how he makes you feel and what he gives you and everything and all the other benefits of that? And so when you ask that question, that's when it becomes very real, right? Do I love the person, or do I love the benefits? And so that's when that's when comes another level of maturity, let's say, in the spiritual life. Back to Elements, I think one of the reasons fiction is so well is because, one, like you were saying, fiction's not real, but then you're learning truths in ways that you will remember.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So if I tell you like a truth, like, hey, like, well, the sun is round, right? That's different than you getting to see the sun versus you getting really up close to the sun, for example. So it's not to say as, oh, the sun is round is not a fact. No, it is a fact. But my experience with that fact is very different when it becomes a lot deeper than it is. I don't know if that made any sense. But
I get what you're saying. Like, you think about, because I always like to make a parallel to the physical, because it's very easy for us to understand, like, real life, because we live real life. Yeah. But it's like also like in school, like when you're, learning about biology or whatever, there's the lecture and then there's the lab. Yeah. And in the lab, it's not fiction, it's real, but you get to see that knowledge applied in the same way like how stories of fiction work, is that you get to see what's being talked about in the fact applied in the fiction. And then it's also a lot easier to remember that, right? Yeah, because it's inspiring. It's like it's inspiring. It's striking. It's in touch with your emotions. Like a fact isn't as in touch with your emotions as when you're reading something. Let's say it makes you cry because something sad happened. Yeah. Right, and then you learn a lot more from that than just being like, oh,
don't steal because this happens.
Yeah.
Once versus seeing the consequences of what happens and not touching your emotions.
And I think that's the parallel between reading and the saints' lives as well. Another one is that you get to see that lived out. And it's like, oh, stealing is bad. Okay, well, I mean, what does that really mean?
Yeah.
You know, and then you look at, you know, St. Moses when, you know, he went to confess to Abba Isidore and the angel had the tablet and wiped off his sins. That's what that means. That's that's the reality of it. Sure, it's not fiction, but it's the same idea. It's a story. And I think that's why the fiction does so well, because it's stories and they are very extravagant compared to real life. And that's why they're easy to remember. But same idea is that the saints' stories, the saints, the reading, it's all intertwined because it's the same. Like that. That's how human nature works.
Yeah.
That's how we learn.
I think it connects to the depth of how we learn. And for another reason the saint stories are so important is like what you said. Like that's what we're taught confession is. But in the life of St. Moses, you see it actually happening where the angels are actually wiping it away, right? That's different from you being told, oh, when you confess, like God forgets your sins. That's a fact. But in the life of St. Moses, it's told and you see how it actually happened. Like, I think he has one of the most inspiring stories because you see that complete 180, and that 180 like happened in real life.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a story, right?
It's real life.
Or fiction. It's real life.
Mm-hmm.
Where someone who was a murderer, who was addicted to lust and all these different things, became one of the greatest saints in the church. So in a way, it's almost inspirational. Like the saints are inspirational in the sense that they did it. They were able to overcome. So it helps us to overcome.
I mean, it reminds me, you have St. Paisa right behind you, and it's the same exact thing where you have someone who was a prostitute for how long? 30-something years, I think it was, 38 years, something like that. And then, you know, complete 180. Went to the desert, complete 180, like became...
And the important thing of that 180 is it doesn't happen overnight.
No.
Like in the story of St. Mary of Egypt, she was going to Jerusalem to sleep with people on the ship. She wasn't going to Jerusalem like to go to church. And on her way, she tries to sleep and then with someone. And then when she gets to the church, she tries to enter and she can't enter.
Yeah.
She goes crazy and starts like asking why. And then it says she went into the inner desert. But if you read her story, it says she battled with lust for 17 years in the inner desert. Like this is St. Mary of Egypt, right? Like this is one of the greatest saints in the church. 17 years battling against lust. And we get upset we get upset when we can't fight lust for like a month or two, right? So it's to understand that these things are being, like we're able to overcome them, but nothing happens overnight.
Yeah.
Nothing.
That's all I got. In terms of questions, is there anything else you want to say, you want to talk about? We can talk about anything else if you want. But you answered everything I got.
What are your favorite books?
Great question. Elements is definitely up there.
Yeah.
I'll say The Way of the Pilgrim is something I recently read that I really like. I think the reason why for The Way of the Pilgrim is because of the season of Lent and fasting and prayer. And like the Jesus prayer has real effect. And I get that, like that's Elements is the one that started that for me. And then, Way of the Pilgrim was kind of the continuation of that. Man, there's a lot of books I love. Like the Habib Yurgis's biography is something it's not very a fun book to read. It's a pretty boring book to read, actually. But it just shows you, how a saint in the modern times really changed the landscape of the church and how, it's inspiring that, just because because we always think like these saints are so old. Like we'll never see something like that again. Like
and he's very
all these saints on the wall are like, what's the newest saint up here?
They're not in here, but we have icons of Pope Kirilos and William Shroy Campbell.
Yeah, of course. But I'm saying like you think
William
of like traditional.
Campbell is in the 70s.
Of course,
which is crazy.
Yeah, but you think of older saints. I mean, like you see, these are all saints before the.
Yeah, they're
7th,
all like 4th century.
Yeah, 4th, 5th century. Abba Abraham. Yeah, okay. I guess he's the newest one. Sorry, I didn't see that. Thank you, Thaddeus. But like outside of Abba Abraham, like they're all 4th, 5th century.
Yeah.
And so you always think like we'll never see that again. Like that's not a thing. But no, saints are here every single day, all the time. I had Abuna Gabriel Yaub on the podcast this morning. I was talking about priesthood and about what is something that what are one of his insights that have changed now that he's a priest compared to a layman. And he says, you don't realize the amount of saints that are in our churches every single day, all the time. Yeah. And it's like, yeah, you're right. You know, you encounter saints every single day. I'm sure you can think of, I know I can think of people who, you know, I've met and talked with and spoken to. That turn off on my trip. This one, when you're looking at.
No.
Okay, sorry. Who have, who live a saintly life and who, like, you just meet them and you're like, there's something different about them.
There's almost a presence.
Yeah.
Or like there's an aura, it's their presence.
Exactly.
When you're there.
Exactly.
Like you feel it.
Exactly. That's why I like A Silent Patriarch or, you know, Happy Georgis's biography, because it's the same thing. It kind of reminds me that, you know, the church is a continuing work, and you know, everyone's not going to be a saint, but you can, maybe you're the person that plants the seed in the next saint. Maybe you're the person that, you know, talks to the person that whose kid becomes a saint, you know? So you never know the effect that you have, the generational impact that you might have.
Yeah. Can I ask you another question based off that?
Sure.
Who are your intercessors?
It's a great question. I think for me, I have phases where it changes.
Yeah.
And I think my current one he's actually above you, Abateji.
Okay.
He's on that side of you, behind you.
Why Abateji?
That's a great question. I think for me, what happens is anytime I'm in a spiritual low, I just look for the next saint. So the saint of the Synaxarian of whatever day, if I have a spiritual low, that's who it'll be. So for me, that was Abateji the last time. And you know, it's just like, I'm not like you, and I don't have that close of a relationship with the saints. Like the person that you remind me the most of in that regard is my dad. But I mean, he's something else. He can talk about saints for days. I mean, he really lives with saints. Actually, Abba Abram is his intercessor. But
I bet you he has a story with every single saint that he can tell you that happened in his personal life.
Probably,
Yeah.
but he will never come on the podcast and say it, no matter how hard I've tried.
You might have to just record it
on the side, because then insert it in. Maybe one day. But you know, I think there's, I think for me, because of the amount of time I spend at Tasbeh is my spiritual love language, to be honest. You know, the psallies for some of the saints. I think for me, Abateji's psally, you know, really touches me. I will say, Good Friday, there's one, people won't really consider, I mean, he's not really considered a saint, but I guess he would be the right-hand thief, Demes.
Right-hand thief, yeah.
The second paragraph of Ari Pamevi, where it says, have you ever seen a thief who has believed in a king? This thief who through his faith stole the kingdom of heaven and the paradise of joy. I mean, that, like, that's enough for me to be like, maybe not use him as an intercessor, but to ask God to, like, give me that same spirit. Yeah. You know?
I think that's one of the best parts of the saints, like, to ask them for the same spirit.
Of course.
Like, I think that's the whole point of it, of realizing, like, oh, like, he has something that I want to really have.
Of course.
Let me try to get as close to him as I can. You know?
Yeah, and I mean, and like things that people that come to mind are like Pope Shenouda or St. Paul or St. Peter, people with boldness, people with, you know, like a fiery spirit. I think in the past have definitely been my intercessors. But yeah, what about you?
I have a lot. So, like the three ones I'd say I'm closest to are St. John the Baptist, just because we share a birthday.
Oh, okay. Easy one.
Yeah, easy one. He's also the greatest born among women, so like, why not have him as your intercessor?
Of course. Yeah.
And then St. Athanasius and St. Anthony are the next two. And then after that, it's St. Moses, St. Mina, St. Damiana, and the most recent one is Abunam Shoykam. Like, he's been a very, very big intercessor as of recently, just because obviously there are miracle stories with Abunam Shoykam. But I think Abuna Tedros says this all. Abuna Tedros Malti says this all the time, where he's like, the biggest miracle is when you see Christ's action in someone's life. And one of the stories that touched me the most with Abuna Shoykam is a story that goes like, there was a young lady who left the church because she was going to marry someone outside of the church. And so Abuna Shoykam, he knew that she went to his church, but he didn't know her personally. But he tried his best to keep reaching out, try to get to know her, and try to get her to change her mind a little. And so as he's trying to get to know her and he tries to go closer, he realizes like she's not budging her mind at all. And then one day, like, the man that wants to be with her comes and he's trying to like pick her up and like take her and like run away with her. And so Bunam Shoy finds out, like he runs, and he sees her getting in the car, and he starts like pleading with her. He's like, please don't, like please don't. And to the point where like the people like who were with him, like they closed the door, and they started driving away. Bunam Shoy Kemel holds onto the door, and it says like he gets dragged through the streets of Alexandria, like his Galabeya starts to rip, and like he's all bloody and everything. And then she like starts screaming. She's like, stop the car. Like, she comes out of the car, like he picks himself up, and like they leave. And she never returned back. She didn't grow into anything. There is no miracle there other than what action Abu Nushray Kamil took was the action of Christ. To give his life up with no regard for his life for the sake of a member of his flock. And like the reason it's so crazy to me is like that's greater than a miracle. That's literally the action of Christ lived out in Abu Nushray Kamil. And so I think like while miracle stories are amazing, and I love miracle stories, and I just showed you one before this podcast, but like to see a person live Christ is the greatest miracle of them all. And I think he's a very, very big example of that.
Wow. And you did show me one before, and I think that a lot of times people will say like, oh, miracles don't happen anymore. Well, there might be people getting like raised from the dead, or it might be, you know, things like that happening. And I think the reason why, to be honest, is because of the age that we live in. Yeah. Where people aren't going to believe it. And to be honest, like, if you can't believe God with what you've seen, nothing more will convince you. And the story that comes to mind is the story of Lazarus and the rich man, where like the rich man, when he's in hell, is pleading to Abraham, like, at least let Lazarus go back so my family will see him. He goes, nothing more they will see will convince them. Yeah,
he was like he has Abraham, Moses, and the law. Exactly. Like if that doesn't convince you, like nothing will.
Nothing else will.
Yeah.
You have to, and I said this on a podcast earlier this week. The thing about doing a lot of podcasts in a short amount of time is you feel like you repeat yourself a lot. So bear with me. But
no.
We're talking about like hearing God's voice, and a contemplation I used to always hear is that imagine you're in a room like this, and there's just puzzle pieces everywhere. The Word of God is all around you. You have to be the one to pick up the pieces and put the puzzle together. You have to be the one to be aware there are puzzle pieces around you, to go look for them, to pick them up, to analyze them, and to figure out where they fit in the puzzle. But never say that God is not talking to you, or never say that God is not with you, or that he's not around, because he is. You just have to be the one to seek him in every single moment, in every single second of your life. And again, I mean, we keep talking about the saints over and over again. That's what they did.
Yeah.
That's what they did. That's why people say like, oh, like if it was like Saint Moses, like he just asked the Son and the Son revealed himself. It was so easy. Yeah, the Saint does a very good job of condensing the story, probably.
But that's not what happened, right? Like we know, like he goes through many different things.
Of course.
And he stumbles upon the monastery.
Of course.
Or even like one of the best examples with that, Saint Anthony, right? Like it says Saint Anthony actually was contemplating on the lives of the apostles. This is what Saint Athanasius wrote. And so when he was contemplating on beforehand, then when he went into church and he heard that verse, that's why it resonated.
Exactly.
Because he was thinking about it beforehand, not like out of the blue. Exactly. And then another thing I obviously understand it, but like it was hard for me to grasp is like with Saint Anthony, like he saw a woman bathing and she told him to go deeper in the desert. And for him to be able to discern that going deeper into the desert was from the voice of God, like that's crazy to me. Like imagine you were there. You're not. That's not what you think. I'm just gonna be like, this woman's crazy, right? Or like imagine like a little kid telling you something. You wouldn't believe him. Like he's a little kid. But I think, like you said, the same way it is with saints, it is with God in the sense of the more you develop that relationship, the more you hear him. He's always talking, but sometimes we just don't hear him. You know. And I think the reason why the closer you go with God, the more you hear him, is not necessarily because you're closer with God, but because in order to be closer with God, you have to humble yourself more. Yeah. And by humbling yourself more, you hear the little kids, you hear the woman that's bathing, you hear all these people's voices more, and you're able to discern that, no, this is God's voice, you know? Yeah. A few of the monks would always tell us like when we asked them like, how do we grow a deep relationship with the Holy Spirit? They're like, the Holy Spirit's like a child, right? It's like very small, like it has a very tender, like low voice. And so it doesn't scream at you. Like if you listen, if you're quiet, you hear it. After that, like if you keep trying to get away, you won't hear it. Yeah. Like that's clear with the story of Elijah, right? It's not in the fire, it's not in the earthquake, it's not in the wind. It's in the still small voice is where he heard God. Yeah. But obviously, again, it's like we keep continuously saying, it's relationship, it's about progress. It's not long ones.
Yep.
Thank you, man.
That's all I got.
That's all I got.
Any last words?
No. Thank you for having me. Hope you enjoy your time in Jersey.
Of course.
Hope you enjoyed coming to church.
I'm enjoying this room right now. I'm really enjoying it.
No, it's a super nice room. It's where we come to like sit, chill, to think.
Yeah.
You know, it's very nice. You do definitely feel the presence of the saints.
Of course.
Here.
Of course. Well, thank you, Andreh, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Isaiah.
And thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Turn on post notifications, and see you guys next week. Thank you.